notes, such as they are. Okay, good morning. Today is the Mahasamadhi of Lahiri Mahashai, our Guru Paramahansa Yogananda, his Guru's Guru. It's called Param Guru. And Lahiri Mahashai, though maybe all of you know, but just in case you are unclear, it's this gentleman with the least hair up on the altar. What does Mahasamadhi mean? I'll come to that in a moment, because I need to set some context. Today's topic, many are the pathways to truth. As you heard in the reading, is actually telling us two things. One in a more universal, a collective sense, which is captured by the quote from the Bible, and the other in a more individual sense, which is captured by the quote in the Bhagavad Gita. And both are equally important. On the collective, universal side of things, it's saying there are many pathways to God. God, truth, it's a truth with a capital T. They're all the same. And many pathways to God is said both in the sense of all the great religious traditions of the world, at least their inner essence, all lead to God and are equally valid, be it Christianity, Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, Islam, or anything else. But it's also said in another sense that the individual inclinations, preferences, proclivities that each of us bring in our quest for God could also be different. And some people like to love God more than anything else. It's a quality of the heart. Other people start by understanding or trying to understand God from the intellect. And of course, later on, to paraphrase, to know God is to love God, and to love God is to know God, and they all come together. But in the beginning, we start from what our past karma and dharma have made us proficient in. And still other people see God in all human beings, and they just like to serve. And so it says that all of these, the great traditions, the deeper archetypal inclinations we bring to the quest of God, they are all valid. And the warning is, don't become so enamored of your own path. No matter how uplifting it has been for you, recognize that outside of the framework of that, there are other equally valid paths. It's not merely one of religious tolerance or something like that. It is also that, but it is much more than that. If we are truly loyal and attuned in our path, which eventually does foster love for God, then how can we not celebrate that same love as has been shown by somebody else following a different path? So that's really what it is saying, is genuineness and sincerity in our path by necessity breeds appreciation and celebration of all other paths. And it's a very important thing to keep in mind in our times, where the ramparts have been erected to deeply separate opinions on all kinds of things. And so that is one part, and that's what Jesus is saying. For he that is not against us is with us. And the us in this is referring to people that see God, people who are a channel for the grace of God. This particular incident from where this quote is taken, Jesus was casting out demons, and then his disciples, through his grace, also do that. And then Jesus goes off, does some very interesting things. By the time he comes back, the disciples have found another man that was also casting out demons. And they said, "You're not one of our followers. You cannot use his name to cast out demons." And Jesus sees this and says, "Oh, my disciples have forgotten that it is the grace of God that is casting out the demons, and the person that's doing it, this is merely a channel. So he calls them. This is the original come to Jesus meeting. He says, come to Jesus, I got some things to tell you. And he kind of scolds them, if you want to read it. It's a good, solid scolding that he gives. And he ends it with saying, for he that is not against us is with us. So this is the collective part of what today's topic is. The individual part is equally important and somewhat deceptive. Yes, there are many pathways to God, but that's in the universe of all possibilities. There are many pathways to God, but for each of us, you see, that's a statistic. For each of us individually, there is one path. It's more than that. It's not so much that there's one path this month, and okay, I've really practiced Kriya Yoga and whatever my path is, and now it's fall and the discipline doesn't feel like I am in the flow. Mercury is in retrograde. This workshop on Kabbalah was so interesting. Let me go kind of cycle out of it for a little bit and come back. And then by winter time, it's too cold. Who wants to meditate at 5:30? I'll do something else, and then summer come back to Kriya. It doesn't work that way. It's not like eating food. All food leads to satisfaction of hunger, so I eat in a diner today and Indian food tomorrow, Chinese food the next day. The spiritual path doesn't work like that. There is one. So part of our duty as spiritual seekers is to be receptive and disciplined and open to recognize the path when it shows up. And it does. It will, even a little bit of sincere seeking. It'll show up, but we need to recognize it. But we need to be committed, loyal, disciplined, unflinching in its following, because it's not always a bed of roses. Some days it's always, there is a sense of doing the right thing, of no effort wasted. That's all there. But then every now and then it gets darned hard. So that's what Krishna is warning in the Bhagavad Gita. Let me tell you the Sanskrit, and then I'll tell you the word meanings so that you can assemble it for yourself in a bit of a raw format. So it says, this is from chapter 3, verse 35. Shreyan swadharmo vigunaha paradharmat swanishtutat swadharme nidhanam shreyam paradharmat bhayavahaha. Shreyas, Shreyan swadharme vigunaha. Shreyas means something that's right, uplifting, perfect, holy, that kind of meaning, Shreyas. Swadharma, swa, self, dharma, path. My path, your path. Shreyan swadharmo vigunaha. Viguna is imperfect. My path, imperfect, is still very good. Okay, that's Shreyan swadharmo vigunaha. Paradharmat swanishtutat. Para is somebody else. Dharma, path, somebody else's path or another path. Swanishtutat, practiced perfectly. So my path practiced imperfectly is better than somebody else's path practiced perfectly. You got to look at this a little bit more deeply. It's not so much in that sense, but it is that there comes a time when we feel imperfect, ill-equipped to rise up to the rigors required of our path. That says, Krishna is saying that's okay. Let that not lead you into temptation of jumping off and practicing something else. Paradharmat swanishtutat. You might at that point feel far more capable, far more competent. In the flow, it feels right of something else. And he's saying, no, don't do that. Why not? It's the second part. The second part is actually really in your face. It's Krishna's version of come to Jesus. He says, Swadharme nidhanam shreyam paradharmat bhayavahaha. Swadharme, there's that word again. My path, your path. Shreyam is good. Nidhanam, even if you die. And if you die practicing your path, it's still good. Paradharmat bhayavahaha. Bhaya means spiritual crisis, fear, suffering, conflict, practicing somebody else's path leads to great dire inner conflict. And the way to think about that is that we go along, and sometimes after having practiced it for 10, 15, 20 years, often it's wonderful, but every now and then you look back and say, is this really, did I do the right thing? And then he says, Swadharme nidhanam shreyam, it's okay, even if it feels like an entire lifetime has passed in your own path. Because later on in the Gita he says, Nehabhikramanashosti pratyavayo na vidyate swalpamatyasya dharmasya trayate mahato bhayat. Any of you recognize the second part? Even a little bit of practice will free you from dire fears, colossal sufferings. But the first part says, there is no wasted effort when you practice your path. When you come back the next lifetime, it's all there. You pick up from where you left off. That's why we see people. Some people come in here from a young age. They are ready. They don't want anything else. As David was mentioning in one of the classes a couple of weeks ago, there's a lot going on behind the eyes. And you just come into this lifetime with that thing, and then, so that's what he's saying. Swadharme nidhanam shreyam, even if you die, don't worry, nothing's lost. But the other one, paradharmat bhayavaha, that's bad, because you just lose the momentum and then kind of goes away. So that's the collective and the individual. Many are the pathways to God. Honor all of them simply because in the act of honoring all of them, we are more sincere to our path. He that's not against us is for us. And Shreyan Swadharme Vigunaha, even imperfectly practiced, stick to your path once you find it. And the question is, how do you know what your path is? And how do you stick to it? Those are kind of the interesting questions. This is all nice theoretical stuff. So for that, I need to tell you what this Mahasamadhi is and what exactly happened 126 years ago today, September 26th. It happened in India, and there's an ancient city on the banks of the Ganga River. It's called Haridwar. And it's the place where the Ganga River has already flown for maybe 200-300 miles up from a mountain stream, where she's very naughty and ill-behaved and kind of causing all kinds of problems. And now she emerges into the plains, becomes more sedate, spreads out. The river there is about a half a mile wide. It's a very fast stream still, but much more well-behaved, so peaceful. In its very restlessness lies a peace that's very hard to describe. So as a result, Haridwar has been a magnet for sadhus, saints, sannyasis, monastics for thousands of years. And in September 1895, there was one such sannyasi in a small dwelling in the forest outside Haridwar. He spent his days meditating there. His name was Swami Keshavananda. And Swami Keshavananda, one day he was sitting, and suddenly the form of his guru, Lahiri Mahashai, appeared in front of him out of thin air, where he was that kind of a master. And he said, Keshavananda, come immediately to Benares, which is another, even more ancient city, about 600 miles downstream on the Ganga River. So Keshavananda goes, hops on a train, 1895, British had built trains, bless their hearts, and he goes, takes him a couple of days, arrives in Benares exactly on the 26th today, 126 years ago. And he walks in the little parlor is what we'd call a living room. And there, Lahiri Mahashai is giving a discourse on the Bhagavad Gita. And a lot of his disciples are sitting there. Many of them are very spiritually advanced, and a couple of them even become liberated in this lifetime. Swami Keshavananda himself is very, very advanced. And they all sit there enthralled. They are uplifted by the gurus, not just by the intellectual content of the guru's discourse, but also that the voice of God is speaking through him. There is a certain sense of destiny in his speech that day. And then this goes on until dusk, today, dusk. And then at the end of it, Lahiri Mahashai says very simply, I'm going home. Say, what? We are in your home, you're already home. And then suddenly they realize what he really means. He's going home to his home in God. And as Yogananda writes, sobs of anguish rose like a torrent in the room. And because they can't bear the thought of the Guru not being in his physical form anymore. And then Lahiri Mahashai gets up and he makes 3 clockwise circles. It's called a pradakshina. Anytime in the Vedic anytime you do an act of self-offering of any sort, be it meditation, yajna, havan, fire ceremony, anything, you start by doing 3 of these circles. And then he sits in full lotus pose, facing north, the direction of liberation. And to both the anguish and the awe of his students, he sits in full lotus pose, withdraws all of his energy back into his spine. Such was his extraordinary control. And this torrent of his life force, combined with Kundalini, rises up through the astral spine, gathers as a great stream behind his spiritual eye, breaks open a subtle channel up to the brain, and his life force, his soul, riding the wave of energy, comes out of that subtle opening in the brain, and his body becomes lifeless. When great masters who are fully self-realized, they know their time of death, and when that time comes, they don't struggle, they don't resist. They welcome it, cooperate with it, and in fact leave the body with complete awareness. And therefore it's no longer called death. Death is the death of consciousness. But when did the consciousness die for Lahiri Mahashai? It never did. So he tells his disciples, don't grieve, I will rise again. And of course he does. We don't have time to go into that. And that's Mahasamadhi. That's what happened today. And Lahiri Mahashai he's an extraordinary combination of being a traditionalist and a bohemian at the same time. This was back in the mid-1800s. It's hard to think of it now. Actually, it's not that hard for me, but I'm from there. Even 200 years before Lahiri Mahashai's time, India truly was one of the cultural centers of civilization, and it had been so for 1500 years. So the part where Lahiri Mahashai lived was really a great center which was very cosmopolitan in nature. There was, of course, Muslims that came through Persia and Afghanistan, and they were British, French, Portuguese, and India itself has over 20 languages, not dialects, languages, full-fledged languages. And Lahiri was learned in his mother tongue, Bengali. He knew Hindi, the language of Hindus in that region, Urdu, the language of Muslims. He knew Persian, Farsi, and he knew English and French and Sanskrit. So, I mean, it's hard to, we look at him here up on the altar and we miss the bohemian nature of him. He simultaneously was studied English, French literature, and the literature of India, and then all of that. And Yogananda writes that as a spiritual teacher, he was Christ-like in his stature, in his ability to lift his disciples up to a high level of spiritual achievement, and his uniqueness as a spiritual teacher. And this is what relates to our topic, was he insisted for all of his disciples, he said, sit in meditation and directly try to experience God. Okay. For some of you, you will go into samadhi. It will be the cosmic experience of oneness. But even before that, you get these little glimpses, like seeing the peak of Mount Rainier on a cloudy day. It just comes and goes, and that's enough. There's no more need for debate or discourse as to whether my path is good or your path is good. Get that glimpse. And so he took the rituals and added on to it the element of practice so that you could understand the ritual no matter what the tradition is. What was the practice? It was the practice of Kriya Yoga. It's an impossibly ancient practice. As Swami Kriyananda says, Kriya Yoga was there when galaxies were formed, not because somebody was there to discover it. Maybe there was, who knows? Well, that's semantically, I kind of confused myself in my head. Let me go back. Kriya Yoga is so, it's ancient simply because it's archetypal to what creation is and consciousness is. And but it was kind of hidden behind many barriers simply because of the material age, that it wouldn't make sense. And when Lahiri met his Guru Babaji, he said, Guru Deva, can I give this freely to all sincere seekers, because it's the age of energy. And seeking permission, he gives it to everybody. So he insists on direct experience and teaches the practice of Kriya Yoga, and thereby the Christian rituals, the Hindu rituals, the Islamic rituals, Buddhist rituals, everything, they become infused with the inner meaning that they came with to begin with. So talk about celebrating all paths to God. That's it, shining a light on the true essence of all paths individually. That's what Lahiri Mahashaya did. Okay? And so by marrying practice, by introducing practice, he eliminated debate. By teaching direct experience of God, he celebrated all paths. And that's kind of what we celebrate today, and that's why it's so apropos, so relevant, this particular topic. It's so to commemorate that, let's ask ourselves, how do we find what our path is? How do we know? It's Krishna has put the fear of God in us. I think, Shreyat Swadharme Vigunah Swadharme Nidhanam Shreyam, better to die doing your practice. Don't even think about practicing somebody else's. Now, the question is, how do I know what my path is? Well, whenever I talk about this, I feel a little self-conscious, because sitting around me are people that are so much more intuitive and tuned into this than I am. But for what it's worth, here's what's worked for me. The first one, there's three things that are obvious and one that isn't. The three obvious things, how do I find my practice, my path? If you're on a path where everything feels so easy every day, it's like, oh, tra-la-la-la-la, it's good, no real change is being asked for every day, it's gathering with friends and sunny days and all of that, it's probably either it's not the right path or you're not practicing it right. Because the spiritual path is one of getting rid of suffering, the causes of suffering. There's in the famous novel Anna Karenina, Leo Tolstoy, he begins the novel by saying, what is that? All happy families are alike, but all unhappy families each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. That's why we do have so many spiritual paths. The bliss that we seek is all the same. In the end, they've all described it the same way. Every saint has described it the same way. But what's covering it, the delusion that covers it, is different for each one of us. That's why the path of yoga is not one of progression, but it is one of revelation. And each of us needs to reveal it in a different way. And that means, as Sister Jnanamata, one of the foremost woman disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda, our guru, she used to say that suffering is good because it reveals the truth and turns you towards God. And she writes to a disciple. The disciple said, oh yeah, Sister Jnanamata, I heard what you said. I am suffering, but I'll know to tolerate it. And she says, tolerate? What do you mean? Do you glorify your suffering? Do you cherish it? Do you welcome it? So if the path that you're on feels all so easy peasy and nothing's happening, and then it's probably not the right thing, or you're not tuning into it properly. Welcome the opportunities for change. Again, Sister Gyanamata, she once, I was thinking of the right prayer because I knew I had to go through an unpleasant experience. And God suggested to me the prayer that he would listen to. And you know what that prayer was? He says, change nothing of my circumstance, Lord, instead change me. So that's one clue to what your path might be. The second one is it feels familiar. There is not in any linear way, although for some people it is linear, including for Lahiri himself. When he found his guru, Babaji, he was 33 years old, in the Dronagiri mountains of Himalayas. Babaji comes to him and he feels this attraction towards this man, this great saint. He says, do you recognize me? Do you recognize this cave? He says, no. And Babaji walks up to him and, as Yogananda says, gently strikes his forehead with his palm. And then the current of consciousness that sweeps through his brain awakens the seeds of past lives, and he says, this cave, this is where I meditated, this is my water pot, this is my meditation blanket, and you are my guru. And now that's a level of familiarity that's kind of out there. It won't happen, it may not happen for us that way, although for Swami Kriyananda it was pretty close. It was a very similar experience. But I just wonder, if I'm in the Himalayas and somebody came and struck me on the forehead, I'd probably be annoyed. There's no familiarity there. But that's my level of awakening. Nonetheless, I too had that sense when I walked in, saw the altar. It was, I couldn't explain it. I called my mom and said, isn't he my maternal uncle, the one that died recently? He said, absolutely not. He doesn't even look anywhere close. She thought I was deluded. But how many people that have walked into this temple and said, I've been seeing this, I just needed to come in and check this out. Saw the photo of Yogananda in Autobiography of a Yogi and said, I don't know what it is, it just spoke to me. Familiarity, when that happens to you, that is a great gift. We waited lifetimes for the consciousness of that familiarity to arise. Don't take it lightly, it is a big deal. Then the third one is that it feels right. It answers the questions that you didn't even know you had. Your worldview falls into place. You may not always agree with it, but your need to disagree reduces drastically because there is something in those writings. That certainly happened to me. I did grow up with Autobiography of a Yogi and all the Vedantic teachings, and it's like, whatever, it's just whatever. Anyway, but then when I actually started meditating and read the Autobiography of a Yogi, Art and Science of Raja Yoga, and so on, you just see there. And I often find myself thinking, I'm a pretty skeptical guy. I say, I really don't disagree with any of this, and it's an odd state for me to be in. But that's another important indication. Okay, and even your disagreement is more in the sense of what am I missing, rather than this is wrong. When that thing happens, that is again a big deal. These are the obvious ones. The non-obvious one, this will be the last thing that I'll say in this talk, is, you see, as we go on the spiritual path, there are different paths, but as we move along the path, the inner change that happens is the same for all of us. That is not individual, that is the same. And what that is our energy, our life force, our vitality, instead of being spread out, begins to come into its home where it originated from, which is, and I'll just say the spine. There is more to it, but let's think of it as the spine. And then it begins to rise up. Where you can, it's partly physical, but partly energetic, begins to rise up. So the more we purify, clean away the gunk that covers the divinity in us, the more the energy rises up. And when there is a critical mass of this energy that's risen up, then it awakens the greatest storehouse of energy. What is our greatest distraction? Our greatest distraction, I'll use the word that Swami Kriyananda uses. He says the entrenched vitality of mortal delusion. That every time we had a thought away from God, that goes in, deposits itself in the energy bank called Kundalini. That begins to awaken. That's the same for everybody. No matter what path, no matter what individual, what karma, what dharma, doesn't matter, begins to awaken. And the stunning thing is, this is where Lahiri Mahashaya comes back into the picture, roaring back into the picture, is because it is working with energy, there is a technique. I say technique in quotes because it's more than that, but let's, for the sake of simplicity, there's a technique which helps you do this consciously using willpower. What is this power flowing through my will? Can it be other than divine? That chant says, what is this energy flowing through my form? So the will and the energy to increase awareness. What is this consciousness flowing through my brain? Will change what is this life into, can it be other than divine? And that is the technique of Kriya Yoga. And so that finally is the message of Lahiri Mahashaya's Mahasamadhi, is that you celebrate all the paths, whatever path you are on, by insisting on personal experience of God and hasten that experience, supercharge your ability to have that experience by the practice of meditation, prior to which you can do Kriya Yoga. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.